Hey there, we're the Westlaw Pirates and welcome to the show. We're here to share thoughts on Northwestern athletics and college sports, with thoughts and analysis from the visceral to the statistical. We run our tailgate with the red pirate flag flying high above, as we give no quarter, especially the fourth. I'm Sam Walter.
I'm John Lacombe.
And I'm Eric Skoskauspo.
Today we are here to talk about Rutgers. No longer the new kids on the block in the Big Ten. They're now, I guess, old hat, maybe? I don't know. But this Rutgers team, was pretty frisky last year. Going 7-6. I think as we were putting our previews together, I think we think a little higher of Rutgers than we have pretty much since they joined the Big Ten. I mean, Greg Schiano's kind of got things cooking there, huh?
Honestly, there's a couple teams where that's going around, right? And I think, let it not be said that we're not prepared to make a pivot when necessary on teams we have spent years, if not 5, 6, 7-year stretches dumping on. If we see a change, we're going to tell you there's a change. And I think Rutgers is one of those teams we feel that way about.
So, John, why don't you lead us off with a talk about the Rutgers defense?
All right. So, chronologically, the last team that we prepped before Rutgers was Michigan State. And it kind of feels to me sort of right to do Rutgers after Michigan State, because as the Big Ten East came to its end, let the record show that Rutgers was pretty clearly above Michigan State in the pecking order, and really above Indiana too. And in the East-West era of the Big Ten, I mean, can we reasonably say that that was pretty much the dream for Rutgers, right? Load up on creamy frosting in the non-con, beat those two teams, and maybe find 1 or 2 wins somewhere else. And that's what they did last year. And like you said, that's 7 games. And they won a bowl game. Now, did they absolutely get obliterated in their last 4 regular season games? Yeah, they absolutely did. But who cares, right? Put yourself in Rutgers' position. I would say these qualify as the good times right now. And the defense is 100% a part of that. So props to DC Joe Harrisimiak, because this guy is getting it done. Now, again, by getting it done, do I mean stopping any good football team? No, I do not. But this was the number 7 scoring defense in the Big Ten last year, and the number 6 total defense in the Big Ten last year, because they performed against all of the other teams on their schedule, all of the mid-grade football teams on their schedule. Rutgers went 0-4 in games that they had no damn chance of winning, but they won 7-2 in all of the other games. And that's pretty flippin' impressive, especially at Rutgers. And Sammy, not to step on you, because I know we're going to get here in a little bit, but let's just say that if you have a defense that specializes in doing well in winnable games, this is the schedule you want to see. But, I mean, let's table this Cheesecake Factory level of frosting we're going to talk about later. And talk about that, given all of that, this defense has real pieces to work with. And that starts big time in the middle with Mohamed Toure at linebacker. He was phenomenal last year coming back from injury. But we have talked, as a lot of you know, for years about how Rutgers on the down low always has great linebackers. This is a position of strength for them. So yes, they lost Deion Jennings to the NFL this year, but they have an all Big Ten level player in Toure, and next to him, a very solid linebacker in Tyreen Powell. So they're going to stay elite here. And again, especially against weaker offenses, which is where these guys tend to show out. Now, again, it's like repeating the theme. Is Rutgers a great defense because of these two guys? No, they are not. This team cannot get to the quarterback. Only 3 Rutgers players had 3 or more sacks. Only 1 had 4.5 last year, and that was Toure. Okay, this is a defensive line that just gets overmatched against good teams. And Rutgers loses an NFL corner in Max Melton. But so what? This team returns both starting safeties in Flip Dixon and Devin Igbinison. And those are 2 guys who can really hit behind, again, a really good linebacker core. And again, when you look at what's coming down the pike for Rutgers schedule-wise, which we'll talk about later, and you look at their record defensively last year in teams where they were pretty equivalent from a talent perspective, or at least in that neighborhood, this is a defense that is absolutely thinking about what it can do and not what it can't do right now. And again, kind of ending where I started, like, this is like the way we used to talk about Michigan State. And this is one of those sea changes that we have seen. Like a team that was perennially down in this department, Rutgers, for really the whole duration of our podcast, is for sure on the upswing right now. While a team that was as solid as a rock for years in this department, Michigan State, is majorly on a downswing. And again, it's like, it doesn't happen that often, but when it does, we call it like we see it. And Rutgers' defense is looking pretty good right now.
So Scuzz, offensively, I mean, we were joking before the pod, like, you've got a reunion of sorts with Ethan Kaliakmanis and Kurt Shiraka getting back together. Can we just rerun the Minnesota preview from a few years ago and just call it a day on the Rutgers O?
I mean, not exactly, but I do think that we could call this offensive preview Bonjour Gopher. To get into it, I thought it would take more than one season. I thought Rutgers was going to be able to pick up a fair amount of Kirk Shiraka's offense last year, but that it would take, more than a year for them to really improve statistically. But they jumped up last year, 4 points per game. They got a lot more efficient, and that was even with some pretty rough quarterback play. The combination of Shiraka's scheme, which does great things for our running game, and their new offensive line coach really changed the complexion of this team. They rushed for 170 yards per game, and they cut their sacks in half last season. Both figures were the best that Rutgers has posted in years. Their quarterback, I alluded to kind of like a rough quarterback play, Gavin Wimsatt, he improved some, but really not enough to stop Rutgers from going to the portal this offseason. I mean, his completion percent last year was 47.8%. That ain't going to get it done. Ironically, his best games passing were against Northwestern, Michigan, and Penn State, like pretty decent passing Ds, but he was still below 50% completion for the year. While I mentioned his interceptions were even with his TDs, just not great. He was very effective running the ball, 11 touchdowns, almost 4 yards per carry. But when you look at Shiraka's track record at Minnesota, even at Penn State, he's never been a dual threat QB guy. His system relies on the quarterback to make fast decisions and execute endless RPOs, but he rarely uses that QB as a primary runner. So this is just a situation of like not a great fit. And Wimsatt transferring out to go play in his home state of Kentucky makes a ton of sense. And now, as you alluded, Sam, Wimsatt's replacement in 2024 is also not a dual threat guy. And it is someone exceptionally familiar with Kirk Shiraka's scheme, and that is former Gopher quarterback Ethan Kaliakmanis. Now, the really funny part of this, if you're wanting to take pot shots at Rutgers, is that they have traded a dual threat guy that completes just shy of 50% of his passes for a single threat guy who completes just north of 53% of his passes. But Kaliakmanis, like real talk, was really solid running the Shiraka scheme with the Gophers for he played half of 2022 season. A lot of his efficiency dropped off in the subsequent year, especially his yards per attempt. They took a nosedive in 2023, but that was without Shiraka calling the shots. So this could be a case of QB offensive coordinator, just kind of perfect marriage. Now we've seen that Shiraka's offense is particularly good when it's got a dominant running back and offensive line. All of his success at Minnesota was predicated on that. Now, I don't know that Kyle Monagai quite floats up to the level of Muhammad Ibrahim, but he did run for 1,200 yards last year, and Rutgers returns most of their offensive line, including fairly solid depth. So this is going to be the formula, and we've seen Kirk employ this everywhere he's been. Rutgers is going to pound the ball relentlessly in their run game, and they're going to RPO the shit out of you when you adjust to stop it. This worked fantastically well at times in Minnesota. It was abjectly terrible the couple of years that Shiraka was at Penn State with Sean Clifford. It really just depends on the quality of the O-line and the quarterback's ability to process the RPO game. So my bet on this offense is that it's going to be probably improved from last year. I think, a second year with the system and a QB that really understands it, and jokes aside, is definitely a passing upgrade over Gavin Wimsatt. I think it's going to be pretty good in 23 by Rutgers standards. Now, what's going to keep them from being really good or like actually good by conference standards is their lack of weapons. Kirk's strategy becomes explosive if the RPO adjustment to the adjustment creates mismatches for really good pass catchers. And this is a spot where Rutgers is woefully behind. Their starting trio at wideout is a former walk-on who had 36 catches for 450 yards last year, a transfer from Monmouth, and a transfer from Western Illinois. Now, the Western Illinois transfer is admittedly an NFL prospect, but none of these guys is taller than 6'2", and Brantley, the transfer, he's good. He's an NFL prospect, but he's not the destroy over the top guy that Kirk had in, Jahan Dotson when he was at Penn State or Rashad Bateman at Minnesota. As a result, Rutgers is going to be a very, very good running team and probably a much more competent passing team than they were last year, but they will not be an explosive team. They're going to get the occasional RPO where a defensive brain fart leaves a guy wide open for an 80-yard touchdown, but this is not a team that's going to be able to score at the pace that Minnesota had or dominate a defense time-wise the way that Minnesota had. I mean, should they be able to accomplish like 70 to 80% of what Minnesota was able to do in being the Time Lords of college football 2 years ago? Maybe Rutgers can get themselves up to 9 or 10 wins, but I think it's a little bit of a stretch right now given the weapons that they have.
Let's just pause for a second and think about how nonchalantly you just said the phrase, Rutgers can get to 9 or 10 wins. And none of us corrected you because it's absolutely a real thing. Like, it's like, we're like, oh, maybe, like, it could happen. And it's like, yeah, it could. And probably not. But again, like, we are not stretching imagination here.
Big East Rutgers is back, baby.
If you or a loved one is seriously injured by someone else's negligence, hire Kent Simpson of the Simpson Law Group. After over a decade prosecuting murder cases in Chicago, Simpson opened his own firm focused on wrongful death and personal injury cases. He specializes in car, truck, motorcycle, boat, and other transportation accidents, as well as construction accidents, medical negligence, slip and falls, product liability, and more. Millions recovered for clients. No fee unless he wins. The Simpson Law Group. Compassion, empathy, and vigorous advocacy. Go to simpsonlawgroup.com or call 312-332-2107 for a free consultation, and go Cats. So let's go through the schedule here. They open up the season at home against Howard, not making the joke. September 7th, home for Akron. Then they have a bye week. They then go to Virginia Tech before coming home to play Washington.
A team they beat by 20 points last year.
Vatek? Yeah.
Yep.
Home for Washington, they're at Nebraska. Home for Wisconsin and UCLA. They then travel to USC before having another bye week. Home for Minnesota, at Maryland. Home for Illinois, at Michigan State. I scanned through.
There are three names.
Yeah. I'm strangely not seeing any Penn State or Ohio State or Michigan or any of the three former Eastern teams that would roll up on them every year.
Yeah, that they've played literally every year they've been in the conference.
This is by a lot of metrics the easiest schedule in the country.
That's so weird that you've got games against Washington and USC, and you're calling it the easiest schedule in the country.
I mean, well, first of all, we just have to say how much it frigging stings that we want to go, look how easy this schedule is. They start with Howard and Akron, and then have to go, oh. Like, but by most measures for most teams, those are two teams that are just walks in the park. Moving on, though, I think I would go at it this way, which is, I'll give you Washington, I'll give you USC. Who's the third hardest team on this schedule? I honestly can't tell you. I legitimately.
Wisconsin?
I don't know.
At
Nebraska?
Nebraska or home against Wisconsin, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Scuzz wasn't kidding. they can win 10 games on this schedule. Absolutely. And I know you're thinking, like, it's Rutgers. You got to understand, like Scott said, Rutgers is going to be able to run the ball and play defense, which is what a lot of teams wish they could do. And
for contrast, USC also plays Nebraska and Wisconsin, and those are like the 5th and 6th most difficult teams on their schedule.
Right. And again, this team went 7-2 last year in games of the caliber of 10 games on their schedule this year. Like, they can play with all of these teams. Like Scuzz was saying, they beat up on Virginia Tech last year. Like, I feel like when we talked about UCLA, we talked about how it's the exact wrong team to be given this schedule where they're just getting fed into the wood chipper in their first year in the Big Ten. Rutgers is the exact opposite. They have this absolute cake schedule and a pretty decent team to be going at this schedule. Again, they're not perfect, but they're just, if you look at all the teams that whooped on them last year, they only play 2 teams like that remotely in that caliber this year.
Well, we said last year, basically, if you can't stop the run, well, I think what we actually said was, if you can stop the run, Rutgers has no chance against you. But if you struggle with it, it's a large portion of why we were quite worried about them as a season opener, and rightly so, because if they could run on you and establish the run, they were more than likely going to beat you. And if you look at who they play, with the exception of a loss to Maryland in the last game of the season, that bears out extremely well on their schedule last season. And I think that's going to be a factor this year, plus some. And, Illinois, Minnesota, USC are all going to have solid defenses. We've talked like Washington, Nebraska, Wisconsin as well, but 1, 2, 3, 4, that leaves 6 other teams. So that's 6 wins, 3 toss-ups, and 3 losses. Like, that feels pretty reasonable.
Yep. And again, like, could it all go south? Sure. But I think what we're trying to hammer home is, you who've been listening to this pod for a long time, you've been on the board to hear us talk about a lot of shitty Rutgers teams. A lot. And this just isn't one of those teams. Like, it's just not. And it's coinciding with them just getting this absolute cake schedule. I think that Nebraska, you talked about Big East Rutgers is back. I think that Nebraska-Rutgers game is going to be big time. We back baby stakes in that game. That game in Lincoln. Whoever walks out of that one is probably going to be in a pretty decent place. And I know a lot of you are listening and being like, you guys are yada-yadaing Wisconsin here. When we get to Wisconsin, you're going to understand. But this is the kind of year where the fact that that game's in Piscataway and not at Camp Randall is a difference maker in this game. Again, it could not set up any better for them. Rutgers has to be in LA for USC. They don't give a shit about that. They're looking at all the other games on their schedule and just liking everything here.
This is where I'll point out Wisconsin also went 7-6 last year. So yada-yadaing seems like quite reasonable and appropriate.
So, I mean, where do we project this? I mean, to me, this is like middle of the Big Ten, and with an 18-team conference, middle is kind of a pretty wide range here, but like middle of the pack, you think?
They're a solid team with a favorable schedule. They're probably going to have a winning record again, and top half of the conference. I think they don't play. In addition to not playing the 3 East teams from last year, they also don't play Oregon, the hardest squad coming over from the Pac-12. They don't play Iowa. I mean, they get to avoid a lot.
Yeah.
Phil Steele has them sitting at 8th. And that seems pretty reasonable. I think they could even end up a spot higher than that, just given some of the, could they have a better record at the end of the year than USC? 100% they could. I mean, I think USC is going to beat them. Let's be clear. But could they have more wins at the end of the day than USC? Absolutely. And so that's, they could end up even in the top third of the conference.
Yeah. I think 7 wins for them is an expectation. I think they would take that, but they wouldn't be satisfied with it. I think 8 is probably where I would end up. And again, like, you might be looking and be like, man, that's a lot of teams that they have to beat here. But some of these teams, your UCLA's, your Minnesota's, your Illinois's, your Michigan State's, these teams are not great shakes right now. And Rutgers is pretty darn good, and I think we're going to see it when the season moves along.
Anything else to mention about Rutgers before we leave them for the night?
This is something that we're going to drum home with a couple of other teams, but I miss, like, I like our, like, friendly punching bags year after year. I like our Rutgerses. I like our Nebraskas, you know? Those things are, it's like how we had Illinois for all of those years. Like, let's have
all those glorious years.
Right. Let's maybe Illinois can revert to form and kind of restore some balance here for us, because I don't like talking about Rutgers like this, I'll be honest.
Well, let's go ahead and leave it there for tonight. Head to our website, westlawpirates.com, where you can leave comments and questions. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Westlaw Pirates, and email the show, westlawpirates@gmail.com. Tune in next time as we give our visceral and statistical views on Northwestern athletics. Look for us, the Westlaw O'Brien Field, flying the red pirate flag, because we give no quarter, especially the fourth. For John Lacombe and Eric Scasbo, I'm Sam Walter. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.